It was just a book I read, and like I said, my life was completely overturned in about 1 week. Something in my heart just said, this is it. This is what life is about. This is truth. This is what I want. This is what I'm seeking. This is what gives rest to my soul. So many miracles continue to happen with his prayers. Lots of them for non-Coptic Orthodox people. Many Westerners, Americans, have seen him in dreams and visions, had miracles happen with him. He's very active. I always had a deep gratitude for what the saint did for my life, because he really pulled me from the pits of hell in a sense. I was not on a good path. I'm certain that if anyone tastes the sweetness of the life of prayer and solitude, it'll convince them of its efficacy. You have to try it. You have to practice it.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Dust and Glory, a podcast about lived orthodoxy in the modern world. I'm Sona, a storyteller, a mom of 3, and an Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Christian. Today on Dust and Glory, we're honored to welcome a priest whose life quietly reflects the depth of the ancient church. Father Kyrillos Ibrahim left a successful career to follow a call that had been stirring in his heart, a call to prayer, to stillness, to the hidden life with Christ. He is a shepherd shaped by silence, by the Psalms, and by the legacy of Saint Pope Kyrillos VI, a saint whose miracles were born not out of power, but out of unceasing prayer. And in his book, All That I Have Is Yours, 100 Meditations with Saint Paul Kyrillos VI on the spiritual life, Father Kyrillos invites us into the same inner room, the place where the soul meets God and where wounds begin to heal. Today we speak about the spiritual life of the saints, the struggle to be still, the mystery of suffering, and the joy of belonging fully to God. Before we start, friends, I would like to remind you that this video is a collaboration between the Western Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church and myself. We would really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel, Ola Sona, as well as the channel of the Western Diocese. You will find all the links in the description to this video. And now let's welcome our special guest, Father Kyrillos. Abuna, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Sonat. I'm happy to be with you.
Please tell me everything about your childhood, about your youth. I would love to hear that. How did your journey into faith started? And when it got interrupted?
Okay. Well, I was born in Egypt in 1970, and my parents immigrated the very same year that I was born, when I was just 6 months old, here to Los Angeles. Actually, we first lived here in Burbank. And I grew up in Southern California until my junior high years. And at that time, my father's work took us up to the San Francisco Bay Area. So my junior high school, college years were there. And that's where I met my wife and had my first child. I have 2 children, 29 and 23. My first child was born in Oakland, California. And in 2001, we moved back down to Southern California. We lived in San Diego. I was ordained a priest in 2007, and I served in San Diego for a couple of years, and then was transferred to a parish in Irvine, California, St. Marina's, where I served for about 5 years. And in 2014, I was transferred to St. Paul's American Coptic Orthodox Church, where I've been serving until now. So that's sort of a very brief sketch of my life. I was raised in the church, baptized and raised in the church, but there was a period of my life beginning in my junior high years and extending really into the beginning of my college years, where I drifted away from my faith, and I'm not sure how much you want to get into that, but it was mostly a result of a number of circumstances. When we moved to San Francisco, there was only one Coptic Orthodox parish that was in the whole of the Northern California at that time, and most of the clergy that were serving were coming and going from Egypt. And as someone who grew up in the Western world, in the States, I didn't really speak Arabic. So the church was increasingly becoming a bit foreign to me, in terms of the culture, the language. So I was very much disengaged from the time that I was in junior high. At the same time, I was increasingly becoming more involved in the study of music. I started playing guitar, and by the time I was in high school, I was in a band, and we were playing clubs.
Oh.
And I was even teaching guitar lessons at a music store. It was something that I really, delved into with a tremendous amount of effort and intensity. I mean, it was something that I was so consumed by that even, I would say, in terms of just time, I would practice 6 to 8 hours a day, of my instrument.
You were serious about it.
I was serious, but I was, initially it was sort of the hard rock, 80s hard rock scene that I was a part of. And with that, of course, comes a lot of the baggage. And if you're not close to God and the church, you can get a sense of, what that lifestyle looks like. So by the time I finished high school, I was at least a little bit more serious about the study of music, to include other genres of music, jazz and classical music. And so I went to study music in Boston at the Berklee College of Music, which is a fairly well-known, private music school. Of course, my parents, being very traditional, sort of Egyptian Christian, parents didn't approve and didn't really see the value. But I think they succumbed to my pressure and my insistence. And but at that time, when I was living in Boston as a freshman, now in college, studying music and really sort of fulfilling my dreams, I went through a period where I was very empty, and I started to, maybe it was a combination of being away from my friends and my bandmates and the party scene that consumed much of my social life, my family. So really just sort of being alone there.
As a student.
And I began to ask, some of those existential questions that usually somebody at some point in their life begins to ask, what's the meaning of it all? What's the purpose of my life? What happens after death? Is there life after death? If God exists, what does that mean to me? I grew up in a religious family. I never really would have considered myself an atheist, but as a high school, sort of, being consumed by my music and interests and the social life that I was living, God was just was just not a part of my life. It wasn't that I was adamantly opposed to believing in God. It was just more of, I didn't need God, so I didn't really care whether he was there or not, and, but now I was 18 years old, I was alone, and I was, at the school that I dreamed of going to, and I started to ask these questions, and they consumed me, and I really felt like I needed to have greater direction in my life. And somehow, the music wasn't fulfilling it anymore. It was at that time that somebody, a priest actually, who's still one of our senior clergy members here in our diocese, sent me a book. It was the first volume of the life and the miracles of Saint Pope Kyrillos VI, who I didn't know anything about. Although looking back after that, his picture was in our home, but I didn't, pay any attention to it. And something happened when I read that book. I'm not even sure why I read it. I think the cover of the book is a very striking image, black and white image of the saint. And so maybe I was curious. But somehow I started reading the book and I just began to weep. I just, something happened in my heart, and it's very difficult to try to describe a moment where you realize your whole life has been overturned, and there was this sense that I knew at that moment that my life was not going to be the same, and that I had a taste of God's love. I had a taste of the joy of faith, and this deep hunger and desire welled up within me at that moment, and I just began a period of searching, and finding whatever I can get my hands on in terms of Orthodox spirituality. I immediately lost my interest in studying music and came back home to the Bay Area where my family was. And
Can I interrupt you for? Sorry, what was in that book that was so striking?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a small paperback book, and most of it consists of a brief biography of the saint and stories. But the stories are of encounters that people in my parents' generation had with this patriarch, who was the patriarch of our church from 1959 to 1971, and who was known as a wonder-working saint, a miracle worker. And the stories are not just about supernatural phenomenon. That's not really what attracted me. It was more of his love and his compassion and his humility and his deep prayer life. There were just things that for me were not things that I valued before. My whole life was very much a material focus, pleasure and music and fun. And so all of these things like faith and humility and prayer and mercy and compassion, they were sort of new concepts for me. And to see them very much incarnate in the life of this saint, something in my heart just said, this is it. This is what life is about. This is truth. This is what I want. This is what I'm seeking. This is what gives rest to my soul. And so, of course, that's all to say that this saint was sort of a window to the heart of Christ. He was a window to the love of God. And that's what I was seeking. And so he was just the means by which he introduced me through his own life and his own example to the heart of Christ and the love of the Father. So it was just a book I read, and like I said, my life was completely overturned in about 1 week. And that was sort of the beginning of my return to the bosom of the church. And so I came home and I pretty much locked myself up that whole summer, just reading, going to church. I made my first real confession, as an adult. And then at the end of that summer, I went to Egypt on a trip with a number of youth from one of our churches. And the trip was all around the churches and the monasteries of Egypt, where all the desert fathers were, and where St. Pope Kyrillos VI is buried in his monastery and where he lived. And so a lot of, holy sites, pilgrimage sites. And so, I went to Egypt, and that was like, kind of seeing up close a lot of what I was reading that summer. And so that was another pivotal, I think, part of my return to the church. And then the final one, I think, was when I came back from that trip, the parish that I mentioned in the Bay Area, we received finally a permanent priest. At that point, we were just, priests that were coming and going from Egypt. And he was a very highly educated priest. He had a master's and PhD in theology and patristics. He spoke very good English. And he was a priest ordained in the time of St. Pope Kyrillos and knew him and had many stories with him. So he was like a living connection to him for me. So immediately I sort of globbed onto him, and he saw the enthusiasm of this, this young college student who was just hungry for knowledge and for, integration into the life of the church. And so he immediately became my spiritual father and my mentor and my teacher and everything in my life. And so that's when I think my spiritual life began to really become more stable. And, really everything in my life was centered around the church at that time. And then I went back to college and got a degree in accounting and got my CPA and took a very different course than music.
I had a question about that. So at some point after all these trials and tribulations, you landed on a rather stable path to become a CPA, right, in California. And then it seems like you rejected that path in order to pursue priesthood. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there was a moment that defined your calling, right? Yeah. You realized that Christ is calling you to something more than that. Yeah. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. So maybe just to put some dates to give context, I came back in 1989 from Boston. So I'd finished my freshman year of college there, and I finished my undergrad degree, and that's where I met my wife, was in my senior year of college. And she was from the church. In fact, just sort of as an aside, if she's listening to this, she always reminds me that one of the few times that I did come to the church as a 15, 16-year-old, I had long hair. I wore these 80s rock tight pants.
Typical musician, yeah.
Yeah, and she would see me she didn't know who I was. I didn't know who she was, but she would see me and she'd be like, "Who does this guy think he is? What's he thinking?" She didn't know that a few years after that she'd marry me. So we got engaged right after our undergrad. So we were both pretty young, 23 years old, and. The reason why I mention that is because in our tradition, like yours, the priesthood is a married priesthood, unless you're going the monastic path. Mm-hmm. So soon after my marriage, my spiritual father that I mentioned, Father Matthias, he began to talk to me about priesthood. And I had no sense of that as a calling in my life. I mean, I still saw myself as a newborn babe in the faith, and so, and keep in mind that there were parts of my past that didn't reconcile with somebody that say, who at that age, was pursuing the priesthood, and so I'm sort of newly on this path, but he saw something that he would reiterate over and over again in my relationship with him and my confessions. He would constantly tell me, he's like, priesthood is the will of God for you. And I didn't see it initially, or I was running away from it.
It was kind of a prophecy.
Yes, for sure. For sure. He was certain. And I remember being frustrated at times that he was so certain, how could you be so certain? You're not God, But
you probably were very certain you were taking another path, and that was not what you wanted to hear.
Yeah,
right?
Yes. Yeah. So, I was in my early 20s, and so the seed was planted, I think, for the idea of a life of consecration and service in the church. But it took another, almost 12 years before I was convinced that it was really my calling, so, and it wasn't until we moved back down to Southern California and I was in San Diego, and everywhere I went and all of the spiritual fathers that I had and the bishop, that was here in our diocese when moved to San Diego, all of these spiritual mentors and figures in my life were coming to me and saying, we see a calling. And I was the only one who was saying, no. I think, again, it was a sense of fear, uncertainty, and just unworthiness. Like, who am I? To take on that role of being a shepherd to people, it's a very dangerous, thing to usurp if it's not yours. So I think I was just very hesitant to accept that it could be my calling. But then there came a time in 2006 where our bishop, His Eminence the Metropolitan Serapion, he called me once. I was coming back from work, and I remember this day very well. I was in my car driving home, and he called me and he said, I want to meet with you and your wife. So I had an idea what it was about because he had asked me several times before, and I said, no, Your Grace, not now. This isn't for me. So I thought, well, what else is he going to talk to me about that he wants to see me in person? So, but I remember I went home that evening and I broke down. I saw my wife and I gave her a hug and I started crying. And I said, I can't run away from this anymore. It keeps following me. And I said, I don't know what to do. I need your help. I think at that point, both of us were not really, not really seeking God's will. I think we were just exercising our own will and saying, no, this is not for us. This is not for us. Mm. But we never really spent time asking God, is this your will for us and for our family? Mm. So we went and we met with our bishop, and he asked us to take the Nativity fast before Christmas, before the Feast of Nativity, to fast and really pray about this matter, and that he would talk to us after the feast and see how we were feeling. So that was, again, sort of the Nativity fast of 2006. And that was the first time I think the two of us, we prayed regularly, daily, and we discussed it regularly. We talked to our children about it. We asked our family. We really went through a discernment period. And it's hard to describe the number of signs God gave us, during that time, very clear signs that it was his will, to the point that we were both, before even the feast, we called our bishop and we said that his will be done, Your Grace, whatever you decide, we're at your disposal. And so that's when the date was set. I was ordained in February 11, 2007.
I'm curious, you said that you were opposing this idea of becoming priest. Were there people in your life, your friends, your family members, who were also opposed to that idea? Were they saying, why would you throw away this stable path and choose something that is so unpredictable in a way, the path that is very difficult?
I didn't really talk much about it with friends. Of course, we did at times, sort of gauge our parents. Mm-hmm. And I think the one person who really was the most opposed from the family was my father-in-law. And the reason is a good reason, because my father-in-law, who passed away last year in his early 90s, he comes from a family of priests. His grandfather was a priest. His uncle was a priest. So there's a long sort of lineage on his side of the family of priests. But in those days, in the early 1900s, and in the stories that he heard about his ancestors before, the priests were often uneducated. They were very poor. They didn't, they had to sort of live off the alms of people. They had to collect money for services, and so it wasn't a position of dignity in society for somebody who has a CPA, right? At least from his childhood, that's what how the church was at that time. But since then, of course, it's changed a lot. Now in Egypt, all of our clergy are educated. Many of them are doctors, engineers, accountants, but his memory of the priesthood, was such that, as you said, he would say, why would you, after you became a CPA, I mean, I worked in one of the prestigious firms, KPMG, so I was off to a very good start in my career. And, and so he's like, I don't want that for my daughter and for my son-in-law, but what's interesting is that, though he was the one who initially, again, this was in my mid-20s when it was sort of brought to his attention. But when I was ordained in 2007, the one person who wept tears of joy on the day of my ordination was my father-in-law. And
oh, beautiful.
Yeah, and I'll never forget that that day, everybody was happy, of course, but he was crying, and he said, "This is the biggest blessing for our family." And from that moment until he passed away last year, he was always the one who always talked about how much he felt my priesthood was a blessing to him and the family. Wow. So it's beautiful to see how God,
but then,
yeah, exactly. And I mentioned that actually in his funeral, that it seems that, it skipped him, but, it came to me.
Yeah. You mentioned that there were signs for you, even the fact that the book was somehow in your possession.
Yes.
You didn't share actually how that book came to your
possession. So yeah, what happened was my parents sensed through our phone calls and their visits to me in Boston that I was unhappy and that I was sort of confused, and so they reached out to a priest that they knew who had been doing some translations of books from Arabic to English, and they basically said, "Look, our son is lost. We don't know, what else to do. Do you have any ideas?" And he just
like Pope Kyrillos.
He just said, I never met this priest actually at the time. I didn't know who he was. He just sent me a package. He was in Los Angeles, and he sent me this package in Boston. And
interesting.
In fact, I didn't even tell him until after I was a priest that small act that he did changed my life. And I remember just some years ago, I went to him and I said, the reason why I'm a priest today is because you did that small act of kindness of just sending me a book in the mail. That's what started in motion everything in my life that led to my service and my priesthood. I mean, of course, God is the author of our lives, but he uses people, and he used this priest and the saint, I believe, Saint Pope. There's no doubt in my mind that he also, whether it's by the will of God or how these things work mysteriously, introduced himself to be part of my life, because not only, like I said, the book, but then afterwards, my spiritual father, Father Matthias, he was a direct link to the saint. His parish in Egypt, my spiritual father was ordained in 1962. Pope Kyrillos was ordained as patriarch in 1959, and he died in 1971. And the parish where my spiritual father was down the street from the patriarchate. So he was with the Pope regularly, and so he had lots of real life stories, not the stories that I was reading in the books, but real life stories. And so for me, he was another link, right, to this saint. And then after that, when I moved to San Diego, the parish priest there, who then became my spiritual father, was a disciple of one of Pope Kyrillos' disciples, who was the abbot of the monastery in Egypt that Pope Kyrillos established for Saint Mina. He was another contemporary saint. His name was Bishop Mina, from the monastery of Saint Mina. And so my new spiritual father was a disciple of another person in this link, And then when I left San Diego and came to Orange County, I met a very saintly woman that became like a spiritual mother for me. Her name was Samira. I've spoken a lot about her in my community, who was another disciple of the saint while she lived in Egypt. And and also was a very holy woman, and had visions of the saint even after, his repose. And she and I became very close. And so I saw wonders through the life of this blessed woman, all connected to the same saint, and just at every moment of my life since my reversion, conversion, whatever you want to call it, the saint has been like central to my life, and through the people that he's put in my life, through the spiritual guides, through just various influences in my life. So that's another, I think, part of my journey that is sort of a mystery to me,
Yeah, it seems like there are a lot of signs for you that Pope Kyrillos is going to play at this point.
Yes.
A lot of signs that Pope Kyrillos is going to play a role in your life.
Yes.
Right? But then how did that become, what were other signs that pointed out to you that your calling is
to the priesthood?
Yes.
Oh, well, I mean, there's a few. I can, recall one incident. During this time that we were praying and fasting, I used to take the train. We lived in the northern part of San Diego County, and my work was downtown. Mm-hmm. So I used to take the train often to work just to, avoid the traffic and use the time to read and relax on my way to work and back. So one morning I was standing at the platform waiting for the train, and a woman comes standing next to me, and she turns to me, she said, "Are you a believer?" And I was sort of caught off guard, that I didn't understand the question, and I don't know who this person is. And so I looked at her, I said, "I'm sorry, excuse me." She said, "Are you a believer in Jesus Christ?" And I said, Oh, yes, I'm Christian. And then she sort of just nodded, and then the train came. We both got into the train, and we sat next to each other, and we started a conversation. It was a very casual conversation. She was a little bit interested to know more about, obviously, Christianity in Egypt. I told her that I was Coptic and the Christians in Egypt and so on. But there was nothing profound about our conversation. And then halfway through our conversation, she looks at me and she says, "I'm sorry, forgive me, but I just want to tell you that I have this very strong feeling that God is calling you to something in his service."
Wow.
And when you're in the middle of praying for a sign, and some stranger comes up to you, on a train, and out of nowhere, like really, like out of the context doesn't,
sign.
Yeah. So there were things like that happened. Another one was for my wife was our son. So at that time, my son was 9 years old. He's now 29 years old.
You have two sons, or
no? I have a son and a daughter.
Daughter.
Yeah.
Nice.
29 and 23. The older one is the boy. Mm-hmm. So at the time, my daughter was a little bit too young to really comprehend, what we were going through and the decision. But my son was, 9. He was old enough. So my wife was very worried about sort of how he would take this idea of priesthood and how it would affect our family. And so she really wanted me to have a conversation with him. And, she was really praying to see what his reaction would be. So we went out, we were at a coffee shop, he was drinking hot cocoa, I was having coffee, and we were talking. And so in the conversation, I said to him, "Matthew, I want to talk to you about something." I said, "You know how Dad serves at church?" At that time, I was doing a lot of youth ministry, and I was very active at church.
I was going to ask you, were you a deacon at church?
Yes,
at that time?
I was a deacon, and I was mostly serving like the college youth. So that was sort of where my focus was like high school, college.
Okay.
And so, I turned to Matthew and asked him, told him, how Dad serves at church. And he's like, "Yeah." And then I said, "Well, the church is asking me to basically like work full time for the church." So he said, "Okay." So I can tell he's not really understanding it. So I said, well, they want me to be a priest, so he looks at me and without hesitating, he says, Dad, that's the perfect job for you.
Wow.
And so, of course, I'm like, I'm not expecting that, from my 9-year-old son. Yeah. And so I said, well, hold on, like, think about what this means. I said, that means that I'm going to look different. I'm going to wear the black cassock, the robe, and have the beard. And I said, what if your friends at school see me and they make fun of you, or they make fun of me, because your dad, make fun of you because your dad looks different or something, And he just, again, looked at me without hesitating. He said, you and Mom taught us to not like let the opinions of others become our own, opinions. So if anybody says anything, I'll just say, hey, that's my dad, and I love him the way he is. So, I call my wife and
it's very profound for a 9-year-old.
Exactly. So I call my wife and I tell her this conversation, and she starts crying on the phone, because that for her was a big thing, So there were like 4 or 5 things like these, 2 incidents that were all happening, like, again, in a short period of time. We're talking about like 3-4 weeks, of a period of time that we were really engaged in, prayer and fasting and conversation about this. So those were some of the signs. And then, of course, I did go to some of my close friends, and say, hey, like, do you see this as something, And then they would look at me like, duh, like, we've all been wondering why it's taken you so long, And I said, really? Like, am I, I really felt like I was clueless that I'm the only one who, didn't see the signs that this was my calling.
That's really fun.
So, yeah, so those are sort of the things that, and again, it's, when you're really praying for the signs, these things make a big difference in those moments.
Wow. You often speak in your ministry, in the sermons, about the secret place of the heart and how important it is to stay silent and stay quiet for at least some time to enrich your prayer life. And I was wondering how, in this world where everyone wants to be heard and seen and liked and followed, how do you teach people to actually desire that silent place?
Good question. Well, I think like many things in the spiritual life, when we taste of something that is... when we taste of something that is of the divine, of the spiritual world, it leaves a mark on us, and it convinces us of the falsehood of what the world offers us, right? So many times in this, so my experience, let's say, of coming to know God through a saint, right, was a moment of being convinced that there was a joy, there was a happiness, there was an experience, a relational experience with God that was so much more true and real than all the pleasures up to that point in my life that I had been sort of, relying on, just to find meaning and purpose in my life. So oftentimes the Christian life is presented as an experiment. Like even in the Beatitudes, Christ, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see it. As if he's almost presenting things as a hypothesis to be tested, like, try this and see what happens, And so I think that that in our hectic and busy and chaotic world that we live in, we all have a sense of the turmoil that's within us, the agitation, the anxiety, right, and the depression, all of these things. And so there's something inside of us that says there's got to be something else that satisfies, that brings rest to the soul, So the life of prayer, again, my encounter with a contemporary saint whose life was all about solitude and prayer and worship, right? The desert and the stillness of the desert, and the life, the hiddenness, the life of being hidden from the world. It's so much a part of our Coptic spirituality. The Desert Fathers, they emphasize the need for solitude and stillness. So I think that it's connected to the life of prayer. It's not something. It's not a technique. It's not something that like you practice, like going to do yoga or something like that. It's connected to a relationship in prayer. But in that context of prayer, there are different ways that we approach a life of prayer. There are prayers that we recite, like the Psalms, the prayers that the saints offer us in our prayer books. There's prayer that comes through like a more discursive method of reading and meditating on a text and contemplating a text, and But then there's also prayer that just comes from resting in God. Like think of two people who love each other, a husband and wife who love each other, and at times their intimacy is through words, and at other times it's through silence, right? They can just sit next to each other and enjoy being in close proximity to each other without speaking. So in the same way, our relationship with God needs the words, it needs the worship, it needs the practice of reciting prayers and reading, but there also needs to come a time when we just rest in God, where we just, one of the Western saints, she said, less words and more love, we're not so fixated on finding the right words. We're not so fixated on, what do I say to God? But just to be with him, right? So another way of maybe describing this is, in the Western tradition, there's a very famous saint, French saint, a priest, Saint John Vianney, who, in his biography, he relates how he used to see a certain peasant come into the church every day, leave his tools at the door of the church, and sit in the back of the church and just sit there and look at the crucifix. And so after some days, he went to him and he asked him, I see every day that you come and you're sort of doing the same thing, but I don't see you praying. I don't see you doing anything. What exactly are you doing? And he said, I look at him and he looks at me, and the two of us are happy, I
love that story.
Yeah. So, it's this idea of just looking at God who's looking at you. It's the awareness of his presence in your life, in you, around you, and resting in that, and not being, again, concerned about finding the right words, more love, less words. So I often tell the youth, start with, obviously, there's, of course, when we talk about silence, there's external silence and there's interior silence, right? The external silence is turning off the radio and the social media and our TV, and finding a quiet place in our garden or in our bedroom, or, But then there's always
How do you do it with 3 toddlers?
Yes, yeah. When they sleep, I guess, right?
When they sleep, yeah, exactly.
But even when they do go to sleep, and even when you do find that quiet space, you still have the noise within you, right? You have all of the thousands of thoughts, like a whirlwind in your mind, all the anxieties, all the things from your memory and your imagination, right? It's noise. And so the Desert Fathers and Mothers teach us how to still the mind, right? How to, through like the use of like the Jesus prayer, or what we call arrow prayers, we can begin to try to silence the noise within, and when we do, again, we taste the joy, the peace, the resting in God. So that's why I said in the beginning, it's sort of like an experiment. You have to try it. You have to practice it. And when you do, I think, this is, again, the experience of the saints. I mean, even one like Pope Kyrillos and many contemporary saints in our church, even when they were called to, like, I mean, he was called to be patriarch of the church, right? And yet he never stopped longing for the silence of the desert. You know, there's a story when they were inaugurating the new cathedral in Cairo. There were patriarchs from all the various Orthodox churches, the Armenian church, the Syrian church, the emperor of Ethiopia was there, Haile Selassie, like all the dignitaries of the state. Like, it was this huge, right? And of course, it was a great honor for the patriarch, right? They're opening this huge new cathedral, and there's speeches, and he the Saint Pope Kyrillos, he turns to his disciple and he says, "Do you see all of this? You know," he said, "None of this is worth like one night in the windmill." The windmill was where he was living as a hermit. It was like this abandoned windmill in the desert mountains. And he said, "None of this glory, none of this honor is worth one night that I spent in solitude." Right. And so his disciple, commenting on that, he said, what did he experience in his solitude to say that? You know, he was just in heaven. He was in paradise with the saints, you know. So they of course have gone through the experiment, and then they relate it to us. And now we have to go through our experiment. We have to put into practice the teachings of our saints about the life of prayer. You know, we need to have spiritual direction from our priest or from our servants in the church to guide us on the path of prayer. Because I'm certain that if anyone tastes the sweetness of the life of prayer and solitude, it'll convince them of its efficacy, you know.
I remember Anthony of Surosh. He's not a saint, but he's very beloved priest in Russian church and immigration. He also told a similar story about a woman that came to the priest, and she was complaining to him that she couldn't hear the voice of God. She couldn't experience God. And he asked her, what is she doing? And she said, I'm constantly praying all the time, all day long. Yeah. He's like, when would God speak to you if you're constantly praying? Just sit down and knit or do something with your hands in the presence of God. And the next day she came and said, I felt his presence. Yes. Because sometimes we really need to, and it's so hard in modern life to do that.
It is, but we can start with few moments in the day. You know, obviously, if we can do it several times in the day, a little bit in the morning, afternoon, evening, but even if it's just one time in the day where we find that place of solitude, of silence, you know, again, it could be in our house somewhere, it could be taking a walk, it could be, you know, in our garden or something, or stepping into a church. You know, I mean, that was one of the benefit of sort of the old country, right? Is that there was churches everywhere that people on their way home from work, you know. I was just heard a story. A priest was saying that a bishop was talking in his sermon about how, or no, it was a priest. He was talking about how he was visiting one of the famous church of St. Mary in Zaytun, where she appeared in 1968. So he went in. He's not from that area, but he went in and he found, you know, people just sitting in the pews in silence. There was no service. So he sees this one man who's sort of like sitting there with his, you know, his head on his hand, and he's just. So he went out, he saw that a priest came in, so he went to go greet the priest. So the priest asked him, you know, so what are you doing here? You know, he said, I'm on my way. When I go home from work, he said, I know that if I go straight to home, all of the stress, all of the anxiety, all of the negativity of the day, I'm going to take it out on my family, you know? So he says, I come here just for a few minutes. He said, I look at all the icons of the saints, you know, and I smell the incense. And he said, within 10 minutes, my whole disposition changes and I go home a completely different person, you know? So, I mean, one of the benefit, of course, in the old countries is that you could just step into a church, you know? I wish we could have that experience here where, you know, you could just walk into a church or a chapel on your way home from work, even just for 5-10 minutes, you know, and find that, center yourself in that peace and that, you know. So I think there are ways that we can, you know, when we drive, you know, I mean, we all spend lots of time in traffic. Turn the radio off. You know, sometimes we justify it by saying, but I'm listening to a sermon, I'm listening to a podcast, right? I mean, I want them to listen to your podcast,
true,
of course.
Yeah.
But there are even times where, like, even turn off the religious, you know, because sometimes even the religious content we're just consuming it. We're like consumerists of everything, including religious content.
That's a good point. I never thought about it that way. Yeah.
So sometimes we just need to even turn off the good things, just to again experience that silence. And so driving can be. I remember once I was talking to an old Jesuit priest, Catholic priest, who since has passed on, but he was in his 80s at the time, and he was like a spiritual director for a number of priests in the Diocese of Orange. And we were talking about prayer and things like that, and he was, Jesuits are very, educated, right? Like highly educated. Mm-hmm. And he says, what my favorite form of prayer is? So I was waiting for something, really the sort
sophisticated.
of, sophisticated, yeah. And he says, it's when I'm driving and I just imagine Jesus is in the passenger seat and I just talk to him. And at first I was like, that's not very profound. Like, tell me something about like ecstatic prayer or, but then as I kept thinking about that, I thought, wow, how beautiful that is, that like we could just take our drive home from work and that could be like a time of intimacy between us and the Lord, turn off like everything, and just, and another contemporary saying, he likened our lives to like children who are like in the family. You have your young children, right? So like they're sitting let's say in the family room, and they're all immersed in their toys, right? And they're so immersed in their toys that they don't realize that you're right behind them, caressing them, looking at them with love, right? So we're like that with our toys, that whatever our toys are, it's our work, our material things, our occupations, our projects. And sometimes all we need to do is, and that's where silence can come in, is it can be a moment of just turning around to recognize our Heavenly Father who is caressing us, right? Whose eyes are never off of us. He's always gazing at us with love, And so part of it is just sort of that turning to him and acknowledging his presence, and carrying that. And when we train ourselves to carry that presence, right, then everywhere we are, right, even when we're talking to other people or at work, we feel that presence within us.
Absolutely. When you said about us being able to go to church, that man's experience was he would go to church for a few minutes and then go home.
Yeah.
I had that back in Russia so I was studying at the university, and the church was next door from the university. So every time after that, and now I realize that's why I did that. So to take all the stress and just be with God before I go back to home. I lived with my parents at that time and my sister. So that was such a beautiful moment of intimacy between me and God, that I could tell him about my day and pray and in silence in a quiet place. And it was a church that allowed it had those quiet places. It was a very big church, and it had those places where you could just sit on your own and pray. And I miss that so much here in the US. I wish there were more churches that are open day and night. In Armenia too, it's always, they close at 8, but I think you can even ask after 8 if you really need to go to church, they can open for you. So
one of the things that I think is special about, especially the old churches, is that yes, it's a sacred space, right? There's the altar, the iconography, but it's also like how many people prayed in that space, right? Like over the years, like it's infused with the prayers of people who have gone before us too, So that's why people oftentimes when they walk into like an old church, they feel something immediately different, a peace, a joy. This is not like any other place, and we can't dismiss that part of it is the hundreds of thousands of prayers that, took place in that space, But the other thing too is that we can make our holy space, our sacred space at home. I think you and before you've talked about like a prayer corner, right? Mm-hmm. Where you take your children. And so having some part of your home dedicated to some icons or religious, objects, and, a table where you have your Bible and your prayer book, what we call a traditional prayer corner, can in and of itself offer a little bit of a sacred space in your home, and the kids, respond to that, They can go and they light a candle. I mean, even, that's another thing, right? I mean, in our traditions, the Armenian tradition, the Coptic tradition, just the simple act of my mother. She passed away a couple of years ago, and she grew up in a family that was very religious, and they always, whenever they went out as a family, like on a weekend, to go have breakfast or to go somewhere, they would always stop by the Church of St. George, the martyr, and light a candle. Just that act of like, they would go into the church, they would light a candle, and then they would pray and leave. Not for like the liturgy, And one time they were going somewhere, and her father, my grandfather, said, "We can't go to the church on the way today. We're running late, so there's no time to stop by the church." My mom, I forget how young she was at the time. It was obviously, well, she got married young. She was 16 when she got married, so she was definitely, like a teenager, early teenager, or maybe even younger. So she told her dad, "No, we have to go to St. George and light a candle," And he told her, "No, not today. We can't go. There's not enough time." And so they had this argument, and my mom insisted. So they went downstairs. The car wouldn't start. And so my mom told them, "Okay, if you tell St. George that we will stop off at his church and light a candle, that's why the car's not starting, Wow. And sure enough, the car started, and they went to the church. So even the act of going to a church and lighting a candle was something our parents, grandparents' generation found great value in, And I feel we've lost that a little bit, and that's something, again, the children can really engage in, right? Just that the lighting of a candle is a prayer, it's an offering.
My daughter loves lighting candles, and my boys really like to blow the candle when it's done. The prayer is done. Yes. That's their favorite.
That's what we did with our kids to get them to pray with us. They would take turns who gets to blow out the candle or the vigil lamp.
Yeah, that's so funny. What was something that Desert Fathers knew about the human heart that is completely forgotten today?
The Desert Fathers would say that the human heart is the place where the kingdom of God fully is experienced. The heart is not merely a place of emotions and sentiments and feelings, but the heart is the place where God and the angels and the saints dwell. And so for them, the great, again, experiment, the great quest was to discover the deep heart, to discover the place of the heart. And so you could even say that the goal of the desert was to go deeper and deeper in discovering the place of the heart, And another, I think, way of thinking of it that a contemporary spiritual father speaks often a lot about, but really is rooted in the tradition of our churches, is this idea of uniting the mind and the heart. Part of the consequences of the fall of Adam and Eve was sort of this disintegration of the human person, and that's why there's so much disturbance and agitation within us, right? Is that in the pre-fallen condition of man, there was a harmony. Man was totally in harmony with God, with creation, and with himself. And then after the fall, all of that was disturbed, right? The relationship with God, the relationship with creation, the animal world, right? And within himself. So part of the discovery of the heart is the unification of the human person, right? It's now, I think, and forgive me for saying this because I'm not a physician, but I think a big part of the increase of mental illness and a lot of the psychological ailments that plague modern man is this separation between the mind and the heart. You know, we live now almost exclusively in the mind, which has become sick, you know. But when the mind is integrated in the heart, and the heart is the place of encounter, the place of spiritual perception, it's the place of encountering God, you know. When the mind and the heart become one, then man is whole again. He just rediscovers the harmony, right? So that's why when you meet a holy person, they're totally self-possessed, right? They're not unstable, you know. There's a certain stability in them. There's a constant peace and joy, you know, even if they're suffering, even if they're going through hardship, right? They're living in a different dimension, you know, within themselves that's not affected by the world around them. So I think the Desert Fathers and Mothers teach us a lot about the importance of the heart as the place of, again, encounter and spiritual perception, and the place where man is unified and stands as a complete person before God.
So the heart is the place that balances everything else. It's the place where mind and
Yes.
the needs of the body and the needs of the heart, they meet. And
It's
that's
the
why
center. It's the spiritual center. Yes.
And only through meditation on God's word and through prayer life and some solitude, right? Only that is the way to discover
Yes.
that place, right?
Yes,
According
I think
to Desert Fathers, yeah.
I think the heart, of course, expands through prayer and meditation and worship, and it expands also in the sense of our love for others. You know, one contemporary spiritual father, he says, "My heart only has entrances; it has no exits. Mm-hmm. Everyone who comes into my heart remains there." Right. So there's a sense also that when one discovers the heart and takes on the heart of Christ, then that is a heart that loves the world, the whole world, right? As Christ's heart uniquely loves the whole world. He has no enemies, right? So in the same way, when the heart is expanded, it includes everyone, friend and foe, like, you know, friends and enemies. Like everyone is loved with that love of God, because the heart, you know, and so there's a relationship between the heart and pride, and the opposite of which, of course, is humility. The proud person is so full of himself or herself that he makes no space for other people, right? So pride constricts the heart. Humility expands the heart, right? Mm-hmm. So humility makes, you know, humility is poverty and emptying, like Christ emptied himself, as Philippians 2 talks about. And so when we empty ourselves of our egos, of our pride, of our selfishness, of our desires and attachments, then we make space for God and for the whole world. And that's why the saints they're not selfish, right? They have a love for the world that exceeds whatever philanthropic organization or, you know, society in the world that does good works. You know, I'm not denigrating them, but I'm just saying that the individual heart of a saint encompasses the world in the way that God's heart encompasses the whole world, you know. So that I think it was Father Henry Nouwen who says that our aim is not to find God in the heart of the world, but it's to find the world in the heart of God. Right?
It's beautiful.
Yeah, when we discover how God loves the world and how the world is in his heart, that's more important than trying to find God in the world.
There's this misconception about desert saints that they were antisocial, that they were just running away from responsibilities or from meeting other people. Now, you are saying that they were the ones who actually loved people the most.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about that to prove your position?
Yes. Let me approach it from maybe a little bit of a different perspective. I heard it once said very nicely, like, to be there for the people, you sometimes have to not be there for the people, right? Like today we talk about that in terms of expressions like self-care, things like that. But in the Desert Fathers, they understood that, and Isaac the Syrian, one of the great ascetic fathers, who had a huge impact on the Christian East, he speaks a lot about this, that it is in the solitude, that we discover again the heart of God for the world, that we're able to love the world properly, right? Because oftentimes we love each other selfishly. We want to possess each other. We want to use each other, right? And so what we sometimes think of in terms of how we love each other in the world is filled with egotism. It's filled with selfishness, right? Mm-hmm. But only a godlike person can love someone in a pure way, And so the solitude and the life of worship and prayer that the Desert Fathers sought, and the Desert Mothers, of course, was not to shun the world. It was to discover how to love the world properly. And that's why they were always hospitable, right? You find in the Desert Fathers that, yes, there are times, obviously, where they, shut their doors for prayer. But when they received people, or when they went back into the world, they had such an impact, through their love for others, right? So let's use St. Pope Kyrillos VI, as an example of this, is that, again, a big part of his life, he entered the monastery in 1927. Really, from 1934 until he was patriarch in 1959, he was a hermit, solitude. And then he went from being a solitary monk to being the patriarch of millions and millions of Christians, right? Very public figure. Mm-hmm. But even when he was in solitude, people would find him where his cave was, by word of mouth. And he was not only hospitable to them, but he was able to help them because he was a man of God, right? And so he healed them, he advised them, he comforted them, he guided them in a intense way, in a short encounter that would take us years and years and years to have even something remotely impactful, right? So it's about what I want to get to is that when we become people of prayer and have connection with the grace of God, right? Then we help the world in a supernatural way, not a natural way, right? And there are lots of people in the world who offer natural comforts, right? And natural solutions to people's problems. That's not our role as Christian. I mean, it's part of it, but more important than that is accessing the supernatural grace of God and offering that to one another, right? So that's what the saints do par excellence, right? That's what they do, is they are in contact with the fountain of grace. And then when they meet with the people, or where they offer remedies to the people, it's at a completely different level, So there are stories in my book that talk about, Pope Kyrillos, through his gift of clairvoyance and his prophetic gift, when he was in his cell, he would know who was coming to visit him, that they were coming, let's say, with a sick child, or somebody was coming with a lawsuit that they were afraid they were going to lose, or all, typical problems that, people brought to him. And he was so in touch with God's life, that he was able to not only know what was in their hearts, but to give them supernatural solutions, by connecting them to God, or offering them God's miraculous remedies versus natural remedies, right? And so the beauty of a life of a saint like him and the Desert Fathers is how impactful they were in engaging the world and offering the world something, again, that only God can offer, right? Which is so much more important and beautiful than what we can offer just from a purely natural position. So I think it's wrong to think that these are selfish people. These are people who are escaping the world, right? That's sort of the cliche things that people that don't understand the monastic life sort of resort to as descriptions. But if you've ever met a holy man or woman who is a person of solitude and prayer, the lady that I mentioned earlier, Samira, right? She was, when I knew her, she was a widow, and she had 2 adult children that were already independent. And so she was sort of living like a nun at that point, pretty much all night she was in prayer from maybe 10 p.m. until 4 or 5 in the morning. She spent it in continuous prayer. That woman could help a couple, let's say, going through a difficulty, or somebody who couldn't conceive a child, or in a phone call of 5 minutes, more than me as a priest sometimes could do in hours of counseling. Wow. Right? How? And she was not a highly educated person with degrees in theology, but she had the grace of God. She had the grace of God, and with the grace of God, she could be so much more impactful and effectual in somebody's life in a very short period of time. And it was coming from a real heart of love, not like an obligation, Her heart was full of love for people. But she also knew that in order to be that presence for people, she had to withdraw, right? And we see this in the life of Christ, right? Christ himself, we're told in the very opening chapters of St. Mark's Gospel, that
to the desert,
that he leaves. The people are eager, to come to him with their problems, their sick children, and the disciples are they go to him and they say, everyone's looking for you, but he escapes to go pray in the mountain or in the desert, and this cycle is repeated in the Gospels, right? Encounter, engagement, and then withdrawal. So we all, yes, some people are called to a more intense kind of withdrawal, like the monastics, right? It's a calling. And it's very few people who do that, right? If we think about percentage of Christians that become monks and nuns, it's a very small percentage. But all of us are called to implement that cycle of, encounter, engagement, and withdrawal in our lives. Even if it's like what we were talking about earlier, for 15 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, an hour a day, to go into our place of solitude and silence, encounter God, have access to the grace of God, to that energy, that divine energy that can then be impactful, not only in our families, but the people around us. When you meet somebody who is a holy person, everybody feels peace being around that person.
It's true.
So that even just their presence is a healing presence.
When I was 16, I decided to become a saint. I'm saying it with a lot of irony.
That's your calling, yes.
That's very ironic. So I stopped shampooing my hair, and I took out the pillow from my bed.
Quite the ascetic.
And I took out all the soft pillows and everything that was soft, the soft mattress from my bed. So I made it very difficult to sleep. Still, teenagers sleep pretty well, no matter what. And now I'm in the period of life when I'm begging God for one good night of sleep.
Yes.
And my perception and understanding of sanctity and being a saint and sanctification are so different now. When I realized that those were just unnecessary things, when real trials come to your life, that's when God is testing you, but he's also right there with you. Yes. And I just wanted to ask you, how do you explain sanctification? How do you explain saintly life to those very passionate young Christians who come to your church too?
Yes. Well, it's a journey, right? And so I think sometimes what happens, and maybe what happened when you were 16, is that we get enthusiastic about sort of trying to arrive at the end of the journey, like, ahead of our abilities and what God's calling us to, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not my will, but God's will. And so, but it is his will for us. That's why when you said I wanted to be a saint, you were right. St. Paul says, this is the will of God, your sanctification. So all of us should feel that we are called to be saints. That's not a prideful thing to say. God's pleasure and joy is in us becoming, perfectly in his image and likeness, and so the call to sanctity is for everybody. But the way we grow in sanctity is going to be different, right? And so there is, of course, different paths in life. Like the monastic path is one, right? Where they do take a more, let's say, ascetic approach to the denial of pleasures and, detachments from people, from things, from comforts, right? That's sort of one path, but it's not the only path, right? And there's the path, of course, which the majority of the people are on, which is in the world, right? So one way to think of it is that the monastic life sort of is an image of sanctification by giving us an image of the kingdom, right? Like the eschaton, like the age to come, right? The angelic world. Here are these people already living sort of a foretaste of that age to come, right? And then the lay vocation or the secular vocation is to sanctify the world from within, right? So you and I live in the world, right? Even though I'm a priest, you're a layperson, but we belong to the secular world in the sense that our calling is to sanctify the world from within by being a healing presence, a loving presence, a godlike presence in your home, in your workplace, in your parish, in your community. And so that path is going to be different than the monastic path, right? You're going to find your path to holiness by fulfilling your vocation as a mother, as a wife, as, let's say, whatever your profession is, in the workplace. By doing those things, according to God's will, you become a saint, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not about all of us like despising the paths that are in the world and only seeing that the monastic path is the right way to holiness. It's a wrong idea of what holiness looks like, And in fact, as I mentioned, this lady Samira, most of the people that I've met were the holiest people that I've met in my life were lay people, and they were people who had families, children, they worked, but they lived their vocation as father, as husband, as physician, as whatever, by keeping their eyes fixed on God's will for them at every moment of their life, right? So it's about sanctifying every moment of the day, or sometimes it's referred to as the sacrament of the present moment, finding it in every moment. It could be on the freeway, how you deal with the person who cuts you off. It could be how you deal with the difficult coworker. It could be how you deal with the, your schoolmate who's giving you a hard time over something. It could be dealing with somebody that needs your help. Every day we encounter thousands of opportunities to look up to the Lord and say, "What's your will for me in this moment? How do I be faithful to your commandments in this instance, in dealing with this person in this circumstance? How do I accept, the trials, the difficulties, the sufferings that I can't change in my life, and accept them without grumbling, with gratitude, thanksgiving," right? Mm-hmm. So all of those things are part of becoming holy, right? It's not about just some supernatural feats of like mortification, right? Like just, not eating for 4 days and not, sleeping on a bed. Mm-hmm. Those have a place in some people's lives. But for most of us, it's about discovering the will of God in the here and now, right?
It's kind of the daily faithfulness.
The daily faithfulness, yeah, exactly. And that's how we become saints. It may not look like that saint, right? Like, I've talked a lot about St. Pope Kyrillos VI. I know that I'm not called to look like him in terms of my own life. First of all, I'm a married priest. I have kids. I live in the 21st century. I didn't, live a ascetic life like he did. So I love him, and I keep him as a point of reference in my life. And of course, I ask for his prayers and intercessions as a saint. But I also know that my calling is not to just be a copy paste of his life. That's not going to happen. I have to become the saint God wants me to become, not the saint that I think I should become or that I want to become. And that is, again, it's a journey, right? And that's why having a guide is really important. Having a spiritual father, having good spiritual reading good materials. By the way,
back then I didn't have one, so yeah, you're right, yeah.
And that's, obviously one of the dangers that's in Orthodox spirituality we talk a lot about, and the Desert Fathers, they emphasize a lot. Like the Desert Fathers never went it alone, right? They always had an Abba or an Amma that they went back to. Even just running to them with, I had this thought, what do I do with it? Is it from God? Is it from the devil? Is it from me? And the experienced, Abba or Amma would say, well, it's from the devil, like fight it, or that's from God, accept it. So even the very experienced, ascetics of the church never, chose that path and followed it on their own. They always had a guide.
That's very important, yeah. I would like to speak a little bit about your book. We already established how important Pope Kyrillos was in your life, and all the signs that led to you becoming a priest and embracing Christ. Now, what about the book? How did you come to that conclusion that Pope Kyrillos wants you to write a book about him?
Well, just like the priesthood, I resisted any notion or thought of being an author. That was never something that I thought of for myself. Even though I was always very comfortable preaching sermons and leading youth retreats and meetings, but writing a book was never on my radar. But one thing that kind of goes back to my experience as a college student when I had my encounter with the saint through his book, and had that sort of conversion experience back to my faith. I always had a deep gratitude for what the saint did for my life, because he really pulled me from the pits of hell, in a sense. I was not on a good path, in many ways. And so his intervention in my life, however you want to look at it, and how it happened, was something that left a deep sense of gratitude for him. And I never knew how to repay that gratitude except to just share stories about him, So, in the 1990s when I was doing youth ministry, and then when I was a priest after 2007, people always knew that I was always going to mention Pope Kyrillos stories in my sermons and in my talks. I obsessed with getting his story out. My parents' generation knew him very well, because like I said, he died in 1971, and many people experienced him, saw him. He was very accessible. But my generation and the generation after me, especially in the West, knew very little about him. So I had it as a goal to just talk about him a lot, and then when I got on Facebook, maybe in 2010, 11, something like that, I thought, okay, I'm not really interested in Facebook. I kind of resisted it for a couple of years. And then I thought, okay, you know what? A lot of youth that was before Instagram. So, right. So a lot of youth were on Facebook at the time. I said, I'm just going to post stories of Pope Kyrillos. So sometimes every day, or sometimes several a week, I would post a story about Pope Kyrillos' life or a miracle or something like that. And then I started.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Is that page still open?
It was just my personal page. So yeah, if you go to my personal Facebook and you go back 10 years, 8 years, you'll find several days, every week there's stories. And so usually I would post a picture of the saint and a story, and a different story, different picture every day. And I started getting a lot of feedback, not only from Coptic community, like youth and other members of our church, but from other churches. I got a lot of feedback from people in Ethiopia, Roman Catholics, just somehow that I became friends with on Facebook, or my posts were public. So sometimes people would share, and it would just, make its rounds in other people's timelines or feeds. so I realized how impactful, his life and his stories are to so many people, So then, people would joke and say, like, you talk about Pope Kyrillos all the time in your sermons, and you post about him. Why don't you write a book about him? And I said, what am I gonna write about? Like, his life is out there, and the stories are out there. Yeah, a lot of the stories are still in Arabic, and maybe, but what am I really going to add value to? And then, so it's sort of like the priesthood, right? It was like something in the back of my mind that kept coming up, but I kept, saying, no, this is not for me. Then in January of 2021, it was during the COVID season, right? So I got COVID, and thank God I didn't really have much in terms of any symptoms or anything. But at that time, of course, everybody was, very focused on the isolation, and so I was isolated in my bedroom for like 10 days, and my family was living downstairs, and they would leave food at the door and run, so that, kind of a thing. And so I had like 10 days of solitude in my bedroom. And so I thought, okay, let me organize some of my sermon notes, to put them in like just different topics, like, so that I could refer back to them, like when I do a youth meeting, or I need to like give a sermon on the spot somewhere, like, and I want to pull up something quickly, so it's just more about organizing my years, of preaching, and my notes that I had. So as I was doing that, I realized, like, there's a lot of topics, like different, if you take, like, say, joy is one topic, humility is another topic, patience, different kinds of aspects of prayer, right? So I realized I had like over 100 different, like, topics that could be like meditations on like spirituality, like the spiritual life,
That's when it clicked.
That's when it clicked. Then I thought, okay, wait a minute. So what if I take all those stories that I posted on Facebook, re-edit them, and do like a daily devotional kind of a thing, right? So that every day you would have something from the Psalms, which, of course, for Pope Kyrillos, this was sort of the core of his prayer life, right? He had all the Psalms memorized, and he was constantly, when he prayed over people, it was always praying the Psalms, all from by heart, yeah. So the Psalms were central to his spirituality. So I thought, okay, so maybe if I incorporate the Psalms somehow as a prayer, like opening prayer, and then I'll put one of the stories, and then a spiritual meditation on a different topic, right? So at first it was an idea, and then one of our bishops, we have our metropolitan, then we have two auxiliary bishops. So one of our auxiliary bishops, whose name is Bishop Kyrillos, he...
I wonder why.
Yeah. He's very popular. He's the dean of our theological school. And they were also at the time having a printing press, like associated with the school. So he had also a couple of times mentioned, like, you need to write a book about Pope Kyrillos, and I kept sort of, dismissing it. So he was calling me. I got out of my isolation January 2021. And he was calling me about something related to the school, because I teach a little bit at the school. And so I said, Your Grace, while I have you on the phone, like, I was kind of dabbling with this idea, right? And for me, it was just an idea that maybe like a year or two down the road might, be something more concrete. And he said, oh, it's a great idea. Let's publish it in March, because March was the 50th anniversary of the saint's death. March 9, 1971 was when he reposed. So March 9th, 2021 was the 50th anniversary. And we're now in February, like a month before that. And he wants me to finish this book and get it published. So, of course, I thought, like, this is insane, But then something inside of me just said, you know what? Just try it. So I just sat at my desk for several hours every day and sort of brought it all together as a draft. And through the press, they, quickly did some editing, and we got it out like 3-4 days before the feast of the saint. So it was done very quickly. It was all, honestly, one of the blessings of COVID, one of those hidden blessings of COVID. So that was sort of how again, it goes back to the stories and so really it's a small offering of gratitude, and all the benefits of the book go to the church. I get nothing from it personally, but the most important thing that I get is just the joy of knowing that somebody is learning about this saint that didn't know about him before, or is learning more about him or enjoying the stories in a way that they didn't have access to before. And so the spread of his name and of his, which is, I think, one of the podcasts that you referred to that I was on before, it was all about him, but it was a Roman Catholic or a Byzantine Catholic podcaster.
Yes.
Jonathan? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, so this was an opportunity to talk about one of our great saints, again, into the Roman Catholic world or the Byzantine Catholic world. And, and so...
And now...
And now the Armenians,
world.
yeah. So again, if anything, the spread of his name and his powerful intercessions, so many miracles continue to happen with his prayers. Lots of them for non-Coptic Orthodox people, lots of them, and many Westerners, Americans have seen him in dreams and visions, had miracles happen with him. He's very active as a saint. Yeah.
It's so incredible when you say he's staying very active as a saint.
Yeah, it's the gratification of the book is knowing only that it's one small contribution to that repayment for what he did in my life.
Since your journey into faith started with a book about Pope Kyrillos, the Sixth, now writing a book, what is your hope? Would you say that you're hoping that another youth finds it and through that book connects with Pope Kyrillos?
Yes.
And were there any maybe stories that people shared with you when that actually happened?
So, yes, a big part of the hope with the book was that somebody's faith would be strengthened, renewed, or they would come to faith. Again, through the mediation of a holy person who leads us to Christ. Right. The goal is, of course, to But I always say, like in my own experience, I knew a saint before I knew Christ. Like I knew Pope Kyrillos before in the sense that, of course, I was raised in the Christian faith, but there was a period of my life where I didn't really have any genuine relationship with God.
No personal.
Right? No personal relationship with God. So I was reintroduced to God, to the Holy Trinity through a saint, right? The goal is not to end with the saint, right? It's like he is, just like St. Mary and the icons of St. Mary, she's always holding the child and pointing at him as if to say, like, her intercession is to point us to her son. Yeah. And that's what all the saints do. So certainly one of the hopes of the book would be that it would strengthen youth, the faith of the youth, or anybody really. The book is, there are people who are like 10, 11 years old who are reading the book, and there are seniors who are reading the book, and they all find something valuable in it. Because again, it could be like a daily devotional, because each of the 100 chapters is about a page and a half, right? So it doesn't take more than 5 minutes, 7 minutes to read, and so it's something that for somebody who's not, so that was one goal. The other goal is, there are a lot of people that I discovered in my ministry as spiritual father that don't have a love for reading, or are lazy in their spiritual reading, right? And so they get intimidated.
Is there going to be an audiobook?
Yeah, that's one of the ideas. But part of it is that they're intimidated by picking up a book, let's say, that has like a 40-page chapter, and they just sort of like, they read a page and then they put it down, right? So the idea of offering some form of spiritual reading that is both attractive, engaging, and short, as a way of, pulling somebody into the love of reading, So I saw it also as that being one of the other goals, that it would be a book that I could recommend to anyone. If somebody says, Father, I'm not a good reader, I don't know what to read. This is because again, you could either just read the stories, like I said, the three parts of every chapter, the psalm, the story, and the meditation, right? So some people told me, I just got so captivated by the stories that I just went and I skipped everything else and I just read the stories, And others who said, I really love the spiritual meditations more than the stories. And so I just read the spiritual. So you can almost, even just take, part of the chapter, and then go to the next chapter. So it's very easy to read in that sense. And so there's a couple of, I guess, objectives to the book's intention.
How do you see the journey of that book in the future? Where do you want to take it with you?
Honestly, I tried to be totally detached. I made this offering of love as best as I could with the time limitation that I have, and I don't promote it. I don't really talk about it unless I'm asked about it. I sort of trust that if God wants to use it, or if the saint wants to use it, it's better for them to do their way than for me to do it my way, So I don't really have any follow-up ideas about the book. It's still doing very well. I don't even see the statistics, but every quarter they send some royalties to the church, and so I get a sense of how many copies are sold. There is an ebook version too. So it's still doing well. It has 5 stars on Amazon. I guess that's a good thing.
Of course.
And so I don't really think about, I did my part and I just sort of let it go. I know people have asked, is there going to be a sequel to it or something? But again, my stubborn nature, as you've heard, is that sometimes God really has to hit me over the head hard with some of these things before I am convinced that it's really something I need to do. So as of now, I don't have any plans.
What would be other saints in Coptic Orthodox Church that you would be interested to write a book about?
The beautiful thing about our church is that because we do have a strong monastic life, and because, like the Armenian church, our church is a church that suffered, in recent generations and in the early centuries until recent generations, there's, the church has produced a lot of great examples of heroic Christian lives, So we have a lot of monastic saints that are contemporary. Mm-hmm. Some of them, their biographies have already been written in Arabic, and portions of them translated into English. So I think I've always, because of my love for St. Pope Kyrillos, that I've always had an affinity towards the contemporary saints, because they tend to have a big impact on the generation that follows them, and also because they tend to have more information about their lives. Sometimes with the ancient saints, we have limited insight into their daily life. We have just sort of the highlights. They were born, they did this, they died, they suffered this, that. And we repeat their stories, and they're very inspiring. But sometimes with the contemporary saints, especially when they're still living witnesses, I still meet people in my parish that have stories with Pope Kyrillos, and most of those stories have never been documented, So the ones that are documented are a very small percentage, even though those are thousands and thousands now. But even those are a minority, because most of the people that I've talked to that have had miraculous encounters with him never wrote down those stories. They just relate them in person. So the contemporary saints tend to have, more information about their daily lives, how they dealt with situations and people and suffering. So I find that the contemporary saints are what I would love to see more in English about, and we have in my office at church, I did something very purposeful, and sometimes people ask me about it, is I have on my windowsill, I have about 27 pictures, photos, not icons, photos of contemporary saints that have not yet been canonized in the church, right?
We have them too.
Yeah.
The Armenian Church, yeah.
So these are, men and women who lived in the 20th and the 21st century, just the last 2 centuries, who have a very strong reputation for holiness, and who have not yet been canonized by the church. So that when people come into my office, they're like, who's this? Who's this? Who's this? I say a little bit about them, and people are fascinated. Like, we have already so many canonized saints, but to also think about there's a whole nother, another generation of saints that are going, God willing, to be added to the calendar of the church, that here's their pictures, here's their stories, here's their inspiration that can help us, So for me, I always love, in my homilies, people know that I will often insert, anecdotes or stories from especially contemporary saints. So that's sort of where my passion, I guess, resides in terms of
Has Pope Kyrillos ever appeared to you? I just have to ask this, sorry.
Let me take a sip of water.
Since he's such a big part of your life, and he appears to foreigners who don't even know his name.
Well, it's a very good question, and I don't have the answer is no, and it's probably better that way for a variety of reasons. But for me, his impact of being in my heart and in my mind, and being, I always say that those feelings that I felt when I first encountered him through his book, those feelings are always right there, when I look at his picture, when I read a story, even from my own book, that I've, written and recited and told, when I just reread the same story, all of those emotions come back, and to me, that's the greatest gift, because when I need to repent, I just look at him and I remember my past life and how he brought me from that past life. When I need encouragement, I just look at him and I remember the joy, of to be a disciple of Christ, and to be a child of the saint, So what he's given me really is so much more important than a vision or a dream. Yeah. Not that I would, refuse it, of course, but I will tell you that he has put people in my life that did see him, and that did receive messages from him for me too, that were very comforting, and so
Could you share that?
Yeah. So the lady that I mentioned, Samira, we call her Tant Samira. Tant in Arabic just means aunt. So usually,
is she a canonized saint?
No. She's
one of those people.
Yeah, I do have her picture in my office. She reposed 10 years ago. So she was a simple woman that I met when I was transferred from San Diego to Orange County in 2009 to end of 2008. She, as I mentioned, she was already a widow, and she had 2 adult children. And she was very close to Pope Kyrillos when she lived in Egypt. She was a school teacher, and she had a big miracle that happened with him. And then she became very attached to him. So she used to go see him weekly. And they had a very close relationship. They often eat breakfast together. And so she absorbed so much from him in her own life. And then, as I said, when I knew her, she was already a widow, and she was living like a nun. So she was living a life of prayer and worship. She was always at church. She was the first one inside the church for liturgy, the last one to leave. She spent hours in the middle of the night in prayer and in reading the scriptures, and she had a very close relationship with him on earth. But then he also, in the last few years of her life, was appearing to her regularly. And so what I can say without a doubt, and nobody can take this away from me because I experienced it, was the hundreds of times that I was with her when he came. And he came with signs. The signs usually included a beautiful fragrance of like incense, she was a woman who suffered a lot. She was very sick in the last few years of her life. She had a number of ailments, including congestive heart failure and cancer and all kinds of things. And so I was like her spiritual father. She was like my spiritual mother. It was sort of an interesting dynamic. And so she opened her heart to me about everything that was happening. She was what I would call like a true mystic, and so many times when she was in a lot of pain in her bed, and very sick, he would come, and he would often put his hand or his cross on her head, and holy oil would come down her head, fragrant holy oil, and we would often wipe it and keep it. There were things that he gave her, physical things that he gave her to give me. There were things he told me, through her. So I never saw him, but I saw the signs around, right? I experienced the signs, and they were supernatural signs, right? I mean, when you smell this fragrance, it's unlike any earthly fragrance. It's unlike any perfume or spices that you can create, right? You sense immediately that this is a heavenly fragrance, that's paradise is on earth at that moment, right? So there were many moments when I was with her when we experienced that together, and so those were the other thing that she experienced was in the divine liturgy. She saw him always in the divine liturgy, in the altar. She saw other saints, that she saw the angels. She saw in every divine liturgy, she saw various angels that were in the altar, standing next to the priest during communion, doing their work as angels.
How did they look like? I'm sorry, I have to ask.
It's interesting because as much as she loved Pope Kyrillos, because he was her patron saint, and she saw other saints, but she lit up when she tried to describe the angels. She couldn't describe their beauty, and they were various angels. Some of them were smaller angels that looked like beautiful children. Others were awe-inspiring with wings, covering the altar, whose height was, like above the ceiling, So she saw angels in various forms. One thing that she saw often was, or always actually was, during the divine liturgy, she saw what she described as this beautiful ball of light that hovered above the paten and the chalice where we keep the body and the blood of Christ, during the consecration, the liturgy.
The Holy Spirit?
Well, no, we have in our tradition what we call the angel of the sacrifice. We believe that in every divine liturgy, there's an angel who is assigned to guard the sacrifice and to be at the liturgy. And at the end, we have this prayer where the priest dismisses the angel. And she would see this beautiful ball of light when the priest would say that prayer, like ascend up into the sky,
Oh my God, I'm getting so many goosebumps.
So she, the way I described it is that the veil between heaven and earth was removed for her, and especially those last 2 years of her life. And I was privileged to be the one that she confided in, and she brought into that, and so that's how I experienced, his proximity through, his relationship with one of his spiritual daughters,
And were there any messages concerning your life?
Yeah, she definitely had things that he said for her, that he told her to tell me, and things that he gave her for me. And But the most important, are not the prophetic ones, those are beautiful, of course, but the most important were the things that assured me of his presence, right? Like, she would often tell me, like, she always called him Baba, means like Pope, right? Pope, Papa, right? She would say, Baba is always protecting you. He's always with you and protecting you. One time she had a vision, I'll tell you, this is just one example. In 2012, I went late in the evening to pick up my son from a sporting event. And I got into a car accident, okay? And my car was totaled. But nobody was hurt, thank God. It was just me on my car and a lady in her car, but my car was totaled. And I didn't tell anybody except, of course, my wife, and my kids knew. Didn't tell my parents, didn't tell anybody else. And so the next day I had to get a car rental, and I had liturgy, and I got a call from a nursing home that said, there's a lady here. I had given her communion before. She was close to 100 years old. And they said, she's probably not going to last the night. So if you can come bring her Holy Communion. So I went. After liturgy, I took Holy Communion. I went and I gave her communion. And I thought, okay, that she's going to pass some time within the night. The next day or a couple of days after, Tante Samira called me. And she said, Abuna, Father, I had a vision. I don't understand it. Okay. And I hadn't told her about anything that week. And she said, there were two scenes. The first scene was you were driving and Pope Kyrillos was sitting next to you in the passenger seat.
Oh my God.
And he was smiling at you.
Oh my God. Oh.
Okay. So then she said, and the second scene, which was strange, she said, you were in like a hospital and you were giving communion to a very old woman and he was standing right behind you. And I said, Tante Samira, let me tell you what happened this week, So it was things like that, of course, for me, like, now here's the message, because I don't want people to misunderstand. I'm no different than anybody else. Really, what Saint Pope Kyrillos did in terms of, being with me in the car or being with me in my service is what the saints do with all of us, right? Did I feel him? No. Did I see him? No. Would I have known he was there unless another saint could tell me that he was there? No, right? But now by faith, I know that it's true. And I know that it's true not just for me, it's for true, many times he would tell her, because she could see him and she could talk to him. So many times she would, sit with him for like half an hour, she would touch him. I'd come and I would find where he sat. The whole area was drenched in fragrant oil from where he sat on her bed, talking to her, And so she would say, I want Abuna Kyrillos to see you like I see you. I want him to feel you like because sometimes he would hug her and she would say, and he would tell her, I do the same for him that I do for you. You're no different. Just because you see it or you feel it doesn't mean you're more special, He says, you're both my children and I love you both the same. So she said, but I want him to feel when you like hug him, because he would say that he hugs me. And his response was, in Arabic, he would say, "Ana ma khattash izn," means like, I didn't take permission. I don't have permission, right? So it shows us that the saints, they only operate by the will of God, right? And in God's wisdom, he knows whose eyes to open and whose eyes not to open, right? Now, Samira, she was on her final journey up Calvary. She was in her last years of life. She had suffered a lot in her whole life. I mean, she was a woman who suffered from her childhood. And so God permitted that in those last 2 years of her life, she was able to see things that others didn't see and to feel things, experience things that others. But that doesn't mean that she was better than anybody else in that sense. So I knew she was a very holy person for sure. But in the sense that God's presence and the saints' presence in our lives is there for everyone, and so, well, we have to believe it by faith. It's not something we're going to be able. Sometimes the saints break through, into our sensible world, and people see them, like in Zaytun, millions saw St. Mary, Muslims even more than Christians,
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to speak about the appearance of Our Lady of Zaytun with Father Lazarus, but I forgot to ask that question. May I ask you about that?
So the interesting thing about that story is that I mentioned when I was in college and the priest sent me the book. Well, he sent me a few books. Another book that he sent was about St. Mary's apparition in Zaytun, which was, again, a small pamphlet in English. So it was another part of my shock after reading about a contemporary saint, was to read about, wait a minute, the Mother of God was appearing in a church in 1968. That was 2 years before I was born. My parents were there, and I asked my parents, and they're like, yeah, we went. And, and one of my cousins had a big miracle that happened. He was one of the people that had a miracle that happened when she appeared, in the crowds there.
What happened?
St. Mary started appearing above a church in Cairo in 1968. And when the word got out, of course, thousands, then eventually millions, began flocking to the church. And she appeared usually at nighttime or in the middle of the night, in different forms. Sometimes she was seen kneeling before the cross in prayer. Sometimes she was seen standing and blessing the people. Sometimes she was seen holding an olive branch and blessing the people. And along with the apparition of the Mother of God herself, there were other supernatural signs like celestial beings that look like doves, flying in formations in the sky, but they were like luminous, creatures, not like physical doves. Incense, this fragrance of incense filling the crowd and coming from the walls of the church. Lots of signs, and many miracles happened. My cousin actually had a miracle that happened. He had a serious disease in one of his eyes, and he was, at risk of losing his sight completely. They had gone to all the specialists that they could in Egypt, and nobody could help him. So they said, your only hope is to go to Germany. There's the specialist in Germany. They can evaluate him and do a procedure there. So his dad was a general in the army, so he was able to get permission, to get the visa and everything. So before the flight, where the child, he was, I think, 2 years old at the time, or less than 2 years old, was going, to Germany with his parents, they went to Zaytun. And there was, of course, hundreds of thousands of people in the crowd. And every night, the church, they had prayers and songs, and they would come through the crowds with a procession, holding the icon of St. Mary. So there was a constant atmosphere of prayer and worship. Not just waiting for her to appear. Yeah. So it was late in the night, and they wanted to leave. They didn't see the apparition, but my dad, the procession was coming, and there was an icon of St. Mary, so he wanted at least to go and take the blessing of the icon. So he grabbed his nephew, my cousin, and he had to sort of push his way through the crowds and until he got towards the procession. And then he said that he noticed that my cousin, his name is Rami, he said that he himself, the child, he touched the icon and then rubbed his eye, which was very strange for a 18-month-old or two, but that he himself, he touched the icon and he rubbed his eye. And then they didn't think anything of it. The next morning, they got on the plane, and the mother said, his mother said that he started screaming uncontrollably before the plane took off. They didn't know what was wrong, but they've never seen him that agitated, As soon as the plane took off, he went to sleep. They got to Germany. They went to the doctors. They had all the reports. The doctors said, we're very confused. We examined the child, and none of these reports match the condition of the examination of this child. They're like, he has nothing wrong with him. Go home, So that was one miracle that like touched our family, but there were.
And why do you think he was screaming? Was it because there was no need in going? He was like, "Stop, parents!"
I don't know. Sometimes when the saints or when the Lord does a healing, people feel like the physical effects of the healing. Like the surgery taking place. So sometimes we had a miracle in a place called Port Said where a woman had cancer and St. Mary appeared and literally took out the tumor and put it in a jar as a witness for the priest to see. And she had a scar, so it was an actual surgery that was done by St. Mary and St. Elizabeth and St. Abunub. I think several saints were there. And, and then she put a bandage on the woman. And then when they took off the bandage, there was crosses on the bandage, So the bishop now, this was like in the early 90s, when he comes, he brings that bandage. It still has these red crosses on it. And then many miracles associated with this woman happened that continue to this day, because the picture that was in the room of St. Mary till now streams oil in a church in an area called Port Said in Egypt. So that's been an ongoing miracle since the 90s.
You see, and Eastern Orthodox say that only their icons cry.
No. We
so
have
ours too.
Actually, one of the most long-lasting icons that have been streaming nonstop is the one in Port Said, Egypt. Again, it goes back to the early 90s, and it's you can find videos of it. And the bishop of that city or that district or region, when he comes, he brings the oil. And again, it's not a natural oil. It doesn't look like olive oil. It's like a clear oil with a beautiful rose fragrance, and it comes directly from the icon that way. So Zaytun was probably the most important public supernatural event in the history of the world, because there was no other event that was witnessed by literally millions of people. And there was a recent book that came out by St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, which is Russian Orthodox, about Zaytun. And the author of that book, he examined every possible scientific, psychological explanation, mass hallucinations, every possible theory available, and applied it to Zaytun and concluded that none of them could explain. Like the only conclusion is that it is truly a supernatural event of the Mother of God appearing, right? And then, of course, for us as believers, it's easy because hundreds of thousands of miracles, mostly with Muslims, But the story behind it is important too, because the country was going through a very difficult period in the aftermath of the 67 war with Israel. So the country was very down, right? And there was a growing threat from the Muslim Brotherhood, where the slogan that they kept saying was, today the Jews, tomorrow the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes, of course, referring to the Christians. So there was this growing sentiment that the Christians were about to be persecuted, and blamed for the woes of the country. And so St. Mary, that beautiful mother, right, of mankind, right? Like, she comes in order to heal the country and bring Christians and Muslims together under her mantle, and so that's why, people say, why didn't she say anything? She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was what healed the country. The miracles and her, people that saw her, they said they could see her smile. They could see her teeth. They saw love pouring out of her eyes. Everybody in the crowd that saw her said that she was looking at them personally, So, so there are many, many people in our churches today who saw her during that time, 1968, and that lasted for months, And there was another apparition in 1986 in Shobra, in a district called Papadopoulou. It's a nice Greek name, I think, where she also appeared inside the church, in the dome of the church, and many, many saw her. So there are, and then most recently in, I think 2010, in Giza, in an area called Waret in Giza, she appeared over a church, and again, thousands of people saw her. So there is a unique experience of Saint Mary's love for Egypt and for the people.
It's hosted her.
Yes,
with
yes.
The
I think
Holy
it's,
Child and with
she's
with Jesus and with
very
Jesus.
grateful for perhaps for the hospitality that Egypt showed the Holy Family. Yeah.
Are there? I know there are apocryphas about childhood of Jesus, which canonically are not what we accept. But are there any stories, legends about their stay in Egypt?
There are. I don't know them well enough to relay them like accurately, but I think what's nice is the map. Like if you ever go to Egypt, there's a map of the journey of the Holy Family. And all of the spots are now pilgrimage sites, churches, monasteries, caves, So one can do a whole pilgrimage by visiting the places that the Holy Family. The most famous one is in the monastery of St. Mary in Upper Egypt in Asyut. It's called the monastery of El Mahara. It's in Asyut in Upper Egypt, and the old altar there is a stone altar, is believed to be the fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah, which said that in that day, in the midst of Egypt, there will be an altar to the Lord, meaning in the day like of the Messiah. So it's referring to the Christian era, that in the midst of Egypt there will be an altar, and that offerings would be made on that altar. So literally, this altar is in the middle of Egypt.
Yeah.
And the tradition is that this is the site where the Holy Family stayed the longest. They stayed 6 months. And they built the monastery on that room where the Holy Family lived. And when Pope Kyrillos came to the monastery in the 60s to consecrate a new altar. Now that altar is the only altar that's never been consecrated because it was consecrated by Christ himself. But when the story is, if I have it correctly, that when Pope Kyrillos came in the 1960s 1960s to consecrate another altar in the monastery of another church, that monasteries have multiple altars.
Yeah.
That's the night before the prayers, St. Mary appeared to him and told him, my son has consecrated this whole area. And so he canceled the consecration because he said the altars are already consecrated by Christ himself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
It was such a joy and pleasure to listen to all the stories and
It's my pleasure.
About your childhood.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And may I ask you just one last question?
Yes.
I try to ask, I think I've asked almost all my guests, your favorite gospel and your favorite saint. I assume it's
the favorite
Kyrillos.
saint is that I think we can conclude on that. I think I love the Gospel of St. Luke because
it mentions Egypt.
Well, yes, that's true, and it has it has the Annunciation, which is so beautiful, and Luke 15 has those parables, of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son, and I think I said off camera, that I was a prodigal son, and so till now I can't really read that gospel without like shedding a tear, because it's just, like when you've encountered God's mercy in your life, when you were that person that God ran to meet, and bring back into his home and embrace and shower with, his goodness and forgiveness. There's no story in the whole New Testament or in the whole Bible that equals the story of the prodigal son, And I think I remember, I don't know who it was, one of the fathers of the church or one of the contemporary writers who said, the parable of the prodigal son in and of itself, by itself, is enough to prove that the one who authored it is God himself. Nobody could have produced such a masterpiece, unless it was God himself, and that's, the story of the prodigal son.
And you use a quote from the parable in your book.
Yes, of course. At the end of the story, the father goes out to the elder brother and pleads with him to come in and to, rejoice with the return of his younger brother. And of course, he complains and, says, all these years I've been faithful and you didn't give me his, but the line, which again, we can't even fathom what that really means, right? Like, my son, you are with me always and all that I have is yours, right? I always tell people, just meditate on that. Like, when God tells you that all that he has is yours, what does that even mean, right? Like, eternity, glory, joy, everything that is God's, he's saying, I give it to you because you're my child. It's your inheritance. If we realized, one of the things that Pope Kyrillos, I'll end with this, sometimes, with my relationship with Aunt Samira, of course, I confront my own sinfulness, and so I feel like, knowing that she's seeing him and talking to him and that he's watching over me, right? And I feel disgusted with myself at times, right? And so sometimes I would sort of express to her like, oh, he can't possibly love me. Like, I'm too, the self-pity, right? Mm-hmm. And then he once told her something, and again, I want people to understand this correctly so this is not a prideful thing, but he said, he doesn't know who he is. And what he meant by that was, he doesn't know how precious he is to God. When we see ourselves as unworthy of God's love, when we see ourselves as, unworthy of heaven, when we see ourselves as just despicable, dirty, miserable people, it's good to humble ourselves, obviously, before God. But, he looks at us and says, you have no idea who you are in my eyes. In Isaiah, he says, if a nursing mother could forget her child, I will never forget you. I have inscribed your name in the palm of my hands. So when he said that, it sort of like awakens you out of that self-pity and overly focus on yourself and focus on God as the good lover of mankind, whose love is unconditional, unfathomable, unchangeable, So when he says, all that I have is yours, sit with that, and let those words change your life, and remind you of who you are in his eyes.
Friends, if today's episode inspired you, please don't forget to check out the book of Father Kyrillos, All That I Have Is Yours, 100 Meditations with Saint Pope Kyrillos VI on a Spiritual Life. And if you're new here, subscribe to my channel, Olasona, as well as the channel of the Western Diocese, Armenian Church, WD. You can find previous episodes and more resources on my YouTube channel. Thank you for being here, for sharing this space, and for walking with us in this growing community of faith. Each story draws us closer to one another and closer to Christ. See you next time. Bye.